crossfire of this whole ordeal. I won't let him.
I'm going to give you a hint, whether you like it or not.
The Legend of Heroes, Trails Through Daybreak 2. Coming February 14th, 2025.
Welcome back to Retro Rebound. In today's video, we are talking about one of my favorite ever JRPG series in Trails. I love me some Trails. It's become an annual tradition here on the channel, and this year we're going to talk about it multiple times because later this year we got the Trails in the Sky remake, which I cannot wait for. Kai no Kaseki on the horizon. That game took a little peek into the future after finishing some Daybreak 2. We are in for a scrumdiddlyumptious meal, y'all. But before everything, we got to talk about Daybreak 2. Now, last year we talked about Daybreak 1. And I have this tier list here on screen. I did it after I finished Daybreak 2. I love Daybreak 1. As you can see, it's in the SSS tier, the creme de la creme premium Trails experience, my favorite game in the franchise as of this moment in time. I cannot wait to see what else they do. Again, testing out Kai no Kaseki has me very excited. But Daybreak 2 is up next here. And you may have noticed in that tier list, didn't have the best ranking. And that's because for the first time here in this channel's history, I do have to deliver a very critical negative review for the Trails franchise. It is a rare miss, although, and I will explain in this video, it is an understandable miss. It won't be the worst thing you play, but as you go through this story, if you're like me and you really have Trails and its storytelling capabilities on a pedestal and it's the thing you value most in the franchise, I think Daybreak 2 might let you down in more places than one. There are great pockets like the prologue, as well as the sort of intermission chapter at the middle point of the game. These two moments are excellent. In fact, I'd say the whole front half buildup is pretty solid, although I have my critiques of even that aspect, but it's good enough. Whereas the second half of the game, especially Act 3, is so messy. Now, I said at the start of this that it's understandable why. Why is that the case? Well, Falcom is beholden to, as many corporations are, their shareholders. And that means that in their case, they have to get a game out every year. So they were looking at East 10, they were looking at Trails Through Daybreak 2. One of them needed to come out ASAP. East 10 got the time, and as you can tell by the reviews and the impressions by many out there, it paid off. East 10 is fantastic from what I've heard. But Trails Through Daybreak 2 had to get rushed out. And that meant the game had about 11 months, maybe a little bit more in the year to actually be made. And that's just not enough time for what is a 60 to 70 hour JRPG. As someone who did most of the side content in the game and of course the entire main story, yeah, it's a pretty big game for something that was made in that pocket of time. And in that sense, as I always say with these games that are made really quickly, kind of impressive. But otherwise, looking at it objectively, removing my Trails fandom from the conversation, this game, you can just feel the rush job all over it, including big reveals, big story moments, just don't live up to the Trails potential. So for me, Daybreak 2, even if it's understandable why, it is not the best Trails game. It is a little disappointing to play. But if you love Trails gameplay, then Daybreak 2 has you covered with the same lovely Trails gameplay you got in Daybreak 1, which was a hybrid between action and turn-based combat. You'll have all of that positional tech to work around, like do you want to attack an enemy from a side or behind, and that'll give you little bonuses. New wrinkles have, as always, been added to the combat system, so Trails has never had an issue with combat. It's really, to me, it lives or dies on its story, and here in this case, from my experience, it dies. So we'll get into all of that in this video, ladies and gentlemen. If you're new here and you're into nostalgic, retrospective content, or the occasional day one review, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing. So obviously, I always avoid spoilers as much as possible, especially in games like this for the Trails series, where we're talking about a sequel to an already established story. So if you're watching this like, hey, should I play Daybreak 1 before even listening to more of this? The answer is yes. Daybreak 1 is excellent, and in some ways, I think you could even make an argument that it could get you into the entire franchise. A lot of its big story moments won't pay off for you if you haven't played earlier entries, but if you're looking for just that step in, I guess you could start there, but I'd say at this point, wait for the Sky remake. But anyway, if you're watching this sort of as like, should I invest in the next chapter? It is the first Trails game, and for those who don't know much about my opinions on the entirety of the Trails series, you just saw it in the tier list. Yeah, my least favorite game in the entire franchise is Cold Steel 4. But the thing is that Cold Steel 4 does manage to warrant its existence particularly and thanks to Reverie, which does, I think, justify some choices made in Cold Steel 4, but you just won't notice it in that pocket of playing this like 100+ hour JRPG. But when it comes to Daybreak 2, it does feel very skippable, like a filler story. Like this was just an event in an MMO, basically. So I say all that to just warn you that if you haven't played Daybreak 1, I won't spoil much of that game here, but there will be just elements of the game that I have to talk about to get into Daybreak 2. So with that, let's discuss. So basically what's happening here in Daybreak 2 is there's a bit of a time paradox occurring. This is a game about life and death and choices, and thematically a lot of Daybreak is about nightmares. You know, this game feels like a nightmare, especially by Act 3 with how chaotic it is. It's really crazy, and for some people I think it may feel thematically in tune with the game. However, when it comes to Daybreak 2, what's happening is you have Genesis and something's activating it again, and as people will die in this game, as established in the prologue, you're going to be able to rewind time. So what's interesting about Trails Through Daybreak 2 is it has this sort of, I would call it, visual novel element to it. At least that's what I established immediately. I think of games like Zero Escape, The Somnium Files, these games where you see all these webs and choices, where you're jumping consciousnesses or you're jumping to different timelines and so on and so forth. It reminded me of those games. And I really liked that element of this game because it sets up the story in an interesting way where they're trying to figure out why they're able to travel in time. Is there any negatives to this? But I would just say that the game fails to have a rug pull moment where you'll find as the story goes on that this is their thing they rely on to kind of figure things out along the way. And there's no real failure of that method. And there's no real controversy of like overusing the die and retry method. And so I think that this very compelling Tomb Raider-esque mechanically, you know, Tomb Raider has these crazy gory deaths where you're like, oh my God, I did not want to see her like that. Like, I care about Lara Croft. You have that similar feeling here, where you'll see characters that you care about all throughout Trails just dying in crazy friggin' ways. And you'll rewind time and try to figure it out. And so it becomes too predictable, unfortunately. The other problem is that the game tries to tackle really serious social elements. I'm talking like, we'll say, in-school crime, if you catch my drift, involving certain weaponry. We're talking about corruption and politics. It does feel a bit like Neon Falcom looked at the state of the United States and kind of went like, let's write a story about what we're seeing and feeling here. But much like I've critiqued games such as, say, Dragon Age Veilguard, where they take these sensitive social subjects and try to write on them and either represent groups of people or sort of have a voice in that conversation and open minds. I think it's a valiant effort. I think it's a good thing that writers are trying to do this, but when you choose that path, you got to do it well. You got to do it right. And I think Daybreak 2 kind of touches on all of these things. In particular, I felt it with the in-school crime moments, we'll call it, where I'm like, okay, I'm very surprised they went there, but that's all it felt like, was kind of cheap shock value. And Trails as a series has shown way better writing than that. Again, I'm in the spirit of forgiveness with this game. They've delivered to me some of my favorite JRPGs, hand over fist, time and time again, where I'm kind of sitting here like, okay, in 11 months, I get why they wouldn't spit out absolute peak, especially tackling sensitive subject matter, but it's something that you should just be aware of. I do think that there are certain characters that really evolve in this game in exciting and interesting ways. I like how Van and Agnes's relationship evolves. Ren is an absolutely stellar character in this game. There are other movements, we'll say, behind the scene that are established here that set up things for the future that I also find very interesting. But no doubt, I've never finished a Trails game and out of like a desire to kind of satiate a desire, gone to the next one immediately just because I felt kind of shortchanged with the first one. Usually I go into the next Trails game immediately because I'm very excited. But this time when I finished Daybreak 2, it was a level of like, what? Really? Like, there were a few moments, I'll just say, in big story reveals where I felt, again, very underwhelmed. And while I understand why, I gotta deliver to you how it is that Daybreak 2 story misses. Daybreak 2 does also introduce Marching Garden, which I like the idea behind it because, as many of you know, I'm a huge Battle Network fan. So they pretty much bring this idea to the forefront of like, what if we made the internet this explorable space. However, something's kind of going off with Marching Garden. You're trying to get to the bottom of it and figure it out. It reminds me a little bit of the old schoolhouse, like in Cold Steel 1, where you have this dungeon hub that you're going to go back to multiple times throughout the story. They're going to be like, hey, this floor unlocked, like go and check out what's going on there. And you'll go a floor deeper and one part of the story will move forward while the other more broad political plot will move forward. Like the game is kind of reminiscent of that formula. So you'll run around these different stages. They'll give you mini challenges like kill 5 small enemies or break 10 objects, whatever it may be. A little bit of Reverie as well. Reverie kind of had these sort of stage challenges, if you will. As you finish them, you'll take portals into the next area. You'll get specific rewards. So you'll sort of pick your path through Marching Garden. And by the end, you'll fight these bosses. And so in that, I think it's fun and it adds a little bit of replayability because you can just go here, live here, and just cruise through tons of enemies if that's what you really want to do. Now, while you're here, you're also going to get lots of different currencies that you'll spend in this sort of cube crafting system where you'll be able to upgrade crafts and their strength. So there's a new element of progression here. You're also going to find that there is this kind of RNG loot box sort of thing that no microtransactions, by the way, but this RNG loot box thing that you'll pump a currency into and it'll explode with all sorts of different rewards, sepith, quartz, outfits, fragments for outfits, parts of the soundtrack. Like it's the gamified component of the title. Again, very reminiscent of like old schoolhouse meets Reverie Corridor. And you got something here that I think Trails fans who love the gameplay will live here for a while and just fight and fight and fight and have a good time with it. Especially because, again, much like, say, the Reverie Corridor, where all of these characters suddenly come together in one, in Marching Garden, all of these characters, doesn't matter where they're at in the story, they're all here now. So you can make these fun, crazy party comps, which I think is a special flavor to the Trails franchise, and just invite all these different wacky groups of people together to fight enemies, and I think that's fun. One other thing I really like about Daybreak 2, it's a very small thing, but maybe y'all share this frustration I had with the franchise, is you never fight humans. You're always fighting these very obscure monstrosities, machinery, and it just feels like the only time I'm fighting a person is like in a boss fight, which is cool and all, but I'm like, why is it when I'm fighting gangs that I'm running through like a sewer dungeon and I'm only fighting monsters? I'm never fighting like the gang I'm pursuing. And there's a little bit of, to me, ludonarrative dissonance in that I was able to kind of ignore, but this game does address that. Like you'll fight members of the gang in these catacombs or whatever as you're chasing down, say, a leader of said gang. And I do like that a lot. I did mention in Marching Garden how you'll pull everyone together. That's because in the main story, they'll split you up often. So what you'll have is like a side A, a side B. Think kind of like Resident Evil in a way. Like you have your Claire campaign, you have your Leon campaign, or what have you. What will happen in these chapters is they'll kind of discuss as a group what they want to go out and do, and then they'll all split off and do their own things. And so you'll move through part A, and something will happen with like Swin, Nadia, and someone else. And then you'll go through part B, and it'll be like Van, Agnes, and someone else. And then they'll kind of unite for typically a finale, or most times they'll just unite at the start of the next chapter. I do like this sort of thing in Trails personally, because they really introduced it first with Reverie, where they had these things called Trails to Walk, and you had these 3 different routes, and again, kind of like a visual novel style approach. Like you'd get to a certain point in someone's route and they'd be like, you got to stop here and progress someone else's route. In this case with Daybreak 2, it's more parallel. Like you can just go start to finish with side A, and then they'll shoot you over to side B. That's how it's always going to go. In fact, once you pick a side, that's it. But I do like the option of like kind of controlling your own pace. Oh, what they were talking about in the cutscene before sounded more interesting for like Swin and Nadia. I'm going to go hang out with them. And I do like that Swin and Nadia are a big focus of this game. You know, they were really first introduced in a major way, we'll say, with what we saw in Reverie. And so they are one of the more interesting connective tissues. As you can tell, they're trying to, we'll just say, search for things that were still lingering after the ending of Reverie. And while I didn't think between all of the characters that there were great moments of payoff, again, there are moments of, you know, hope, of good stuff here, where that's why if you look at my tier list, like Daybreak 2 isn't the worst Trails game I've played, because there is good stuff here. It wasn't like Cold Steel 4, which just made me very angry while I was playing. It's the only Trails game I've ever experienced that level of like, what are you guys doing right now? It's not like that. It's just filler is what it feels like at the end of the day. It's filler. It's more Trails. And if you want more Trails, it's money well spent. Like, the game is polished well, it's localized well, dialogue in this game's unhinged. But if you're looking for like signature Trails storytelling, I mean, this is like a long book for many of us in that we've been investing in this franchise for a while. Why would you skip one now, right? But what I'm trying to incentivize you to do is maybe wait for a sale, then pick up Daybreak 2, because then I think you'll feel better about it. The way I actually played it through was in 2 halves. I played like half in August, and then the other half I played in like December, and it felt like 2 30-hour games in that way, and that worked really well for me. But I will just say, for many diehard Trails fans, the fragments section of the game, which is like the intermission I was referring to, may be worth the price of admission alone. It is one of the best Trails chapters ever. Like, I was positively buzzing. But if you're a diehard Trails fan and you're looking at this and you're going like, man, I'm really sad and I'm worried about the future of Trails. But I will just say, the glimpse I took into the future, my friend had Kai, he streamed an hour and a half of it to me, and I just sat there watching and rubbing my hands saying, we were never even done before we were back. We're so back already. So if you're like discouraged about the future of Trails, I'm not trying to like soften the blow too hard for the ultimate final verdict of this review, but I just want to let you know that like, it's not like we're on this steady downhill trend, at least based on what I saw. In fact, it looks like they're looking to pay us back twice over for what happened with Daybreak 2. But nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, those are my thoughts on Trails through Daybreak 2. It's a game that if you want more Trails, buy it on a sale. But if you're looking at this, number one, it's never going to be an entry point for you. But number two, if you're kind of looking at it to sort of feel out if you should be interested in Trails, this isn't the place to start looking. It is the first game in the series that felt skippable. But I am curious if, much like what I felt with Cold Steel 4, where I was like, I don't like this game at all. But Reverie took some elements from Cold Steel 4, and that's what made parts of it really good. So I can't fully hate on it yet until I see what the next chapter is. But basically, I'll just say this as a final conclusive thought. Toshihiro Kondo, who's like the overseer of this franchise and Falcom as a whole, has always marked games as, you know, percentages in the Trail story being complete. And with 10 plus games in the series, you're like, they have to be nearing the end now. What's very interesting is that from Daybreak 2 to Kai, Kondo said that the jump to the finale of the series went from 75% to 90%. And when you look at that across the average of the entire series, this is a massive jump compared to any other entry. So what pretty much happens here with Daybreak 2 is it feels like the story really moves like 2, 3, maybe 5% if you want to get crazy ahead. And now again, they're making up for lost time. Like, okay, we had to rush out, you know, this Trails game in Daybreak 2, but we're going to make things right with Kai. So I'd say keep an open mind for the future of Trails based on what I'm seeing, what I'm reading, and what I watched. But Daybreak 2, wait for a little bit of a sale. That's my thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for tuning in. And with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Let me know what you think of Trails down below. Looking to hear from my people, so fire away. Other than that, I'll catch you on the next Retro Rebound. Peace out.